On July 1st, 1915, along the River Somme in France, French and German soldiers huddled in trenches, locked in a war that would reshape the world. In Chicago, Americans flocked to air-conditioned theaters to enjoy Charlie Chaplin's latest film and catch a break from the stifling summer heat. And in Berlin, a German scientist named Albert Einstein toiled away on something he called the theory of relativity. And on that same day, deep in the depths of the long, cold Arctic winter, 26 men played a soccer match on a floating patch of ice in the middle of Antarctica. Those 26 men were 24 sailors, one stowaway, and Ernest Shackleton, one of the most revered explorers of all time. See, it's strange to think, but in the early 1900s, some of the biggest celebrities in the world weren't just artists or actors, they were explorers, and Ernest Shackleton was no exception. So what was this celebrity explorer doing, playing a soccer match in Antarctica? And way off in the distance, why was his ship being crushed to pieces between two sheets of ice? And how on earth did he live to tell the tale? Let's find out as we paint this scene on Painting the Past. So here is my reference image, and as you can see, one of the first things that we're going to have to deal with is what are the colors in this image? Because the reference image is black and white, or blue and blue. What I'm going to do is take a creative liberty here and drop in a sunset, a distant sunset on the horizon. I'm doing that because I want the viewer to get this sense of vastness and desolation. And by dropping this sunset on the horizon, it's going to emphasize that distant horizon line and show that it's perfectly flat. There's nothing. There's no mountains, there's no trees, and I think that's going to convey that sort of isolation that the crew felt. From there, I'm just dropping in a ton of blue for my sky. I'm varying the shades of blue. If you're painting, you can use any shades of blue you want. Just be sure to use a lot of pigment and a lot of water to really get that density. After that, I'm flipping the paper over and I'm working on the ice on the ground. And remember, everything is loose and wet right now. One of the things that I've learned about painting snow and ice is that it's almost never white. It's always blue and pink and yellow. And so just using very little pigment to get that concept of that light reflecting off the surface. And so I'm gonna let this dry now and let's get back to the story. So Ernest Shackleton's journey to the Antarctic began long before the scene that we're painting took place. At 26, he joined as a sailor on Britain's first official exploration of the South Pole. But he was sent home from that trip under ambiguous circumstances. Official records say that he was marked invalid, meaning his health prevented him from continuing. But there's no more detail than that. And in 1907, in any case, he led his own expedition. And this time he came within 97 miles of reaching the South Pole, which is the closest that anyone had ever made it. But his team didn't have enough supplies to make it all the way, so he had to turn back. Despite these achievements and his celebrity status from this journey, Shackleton was restless when he returned home. One contemporary, Sir Harry Britton, described him as a bit of a floating gent. So, as Shackleton floated along back home, the world watched another race to the South Pole between Britain's Robert Falcon Scott and Norway's Roald Amundsen. In 1911, Amundsen triumphed, reaching the pole 34 days before Scott. So when he heard the news, Shackleton said, "The discovery of the South Pole will not be the end of Antarctic exploration. A transcontinental journey from sea to sea, crossing the pole, remains." And in that moment, his next expedition was born. Shackleton would be the first human to attempt to cross the continent of Antarctica. To fund his expedition, which cost about $8 million in today's money, he reached out to wealthy funders. He turned to the former British Prime Minister Rosebery, who declared, "I have never cared one farthing about the poles." He raised some of the money from wealthy businessmen, and then to make up the rest of the money, he sold exclusive newspaper rights, and he brought a photographer and a videographer along to sell those rights. One of the photographs that photographer took is the source of our painting today. So there's a bit of misinformation here that I want to dive into. It's widely reported that to staff his expedition, Shackleton put out this advertisement in the Times. So far, historians have searched the Times archives from 1785 to 1985, and no one's found the original source. So the earliest known source is a book published in 1944, which in turn led it to appear in another book in 1949, which then was quoted in a biography about Shackleton in 1985. And since then, people have just assumed that it's real. So, fake news? Anyways, in December 1914, the Endurance set sail, aiming for the Weddell Sea, which is just east of Antarctica. But just 2 days into their journey, the ship ground to a halt as it became stuck in pack ice, which is thick, floating sheets of ice that move unpredictably. So the crew disembarked, and they made camp on the ice nearby. By March, as winter deepened, the ice tightened its grip and slowly began to crush the ship. There's a great account in the book Endurance, which is behind me, from some of the crew who described going into the ship to grab supplies and hearing the whole ship close in slowly around them as it got crushed. So while they waited for the ice to break up, the crew had to painstakingly pass the time. It was on one of these long, dim days that photographer Frank Hurley captured the iconic image of our painting today. So the crew and the ship drifted helplessly for months until November, when the ice finally crushed the ship, its wreck disappearing into the depths of the Weddell Sea, never to be seen for another 100 years. With the ship gone, the men were stranded in Antarctica. And here's where the story gets insane. Because the crew salvaged what they could from the ship, they grabbed a couple lifeboats and they trekked across the ice to reach the open water in hopes of sailing back the way they came, in lifeboats. But the ice was treacherous, it was rough and unpredictable. So once again, the crew had to set up camp and wait for the ice to split so that they could row out to sea and make their way out of the Antarctic. So another 4 months went by. By this point, most people back in Britain probably assumed that the crew were dead. They themselves probably thought that they were going to die, but just when they needed it, some luck, the ice broke up. Shackleton ordered the men into life rafts and aimed for a tiny island 400 miles off the coast of Antarctica. And while their ship may have vanished, it is very much about to appear on our painting. So I'm going to give this a shot now. Painting the ship is tedious to say the least. All of those ropes and trying to capture the curvature of the hull. I'm also going to try to capture the 2 life rafts that are hanging off the side there. So I'm going to let that roll beside me because the story is just getting good. So the conditions in these lifeboats as they crossed the sea were miserable. Just imagine it. 16 days in the Antarctic Sea in rowboats where temperatures were as low as 20 degrees a day. To ration their food, on some days they were given just 1 lump of sugar and half a cup of tea all day. The crew also recounted how they were constantly doused by ice-cold waves, so everything in the boat was constantly wet and instantly frozen. But again, Shackleton and his crew somehow prevailed. They made it to that tiny island. But the island was uninhabited. It wasn't an endpoint for their survival, it was just some much-needed respite. So with their energy recouped, Shackleton decided to take a few men, get back on the boat, and traverse an easy 800 miles to the island of South Georgia, where there were whaling stations and therefore people. The rest of the crew would wait back on the smaller island and hope to be rescued one day. So once again, and against all odds, they made it to that island. Story over, right? Wrong. The whaling stations were on the north side of the island and they were on the south. So for context, here is what that island looked like. So naturally, Shackleton saw this and he was like, let's cross it on foot. He wrote afterwards, "I have no doubt that Providence guided us. I know that during the long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers, it seemed to me that often we were 4 and not 3. So at last they reached the whaling station and humanity. But remember how half the crew was back on that other island 800 miles away? The ice pack was so bad that it took 4 tries and 3 months to go back to rescue them. Ultimately, Shackleton borrowed a ship from the Chilean Navy to rescue the crew. World War I started just 1 week before Shackleton began his voyage in 1915. He and his crew returned on May 29, 1917. While the Great War gripped the world, these men were isolated in the Antarctic, far from the battlefields. Their struggle for survival unfolded in complete silence to the world, which was a stark contrast to the chaos engulfing Europe. So before we get to the end of the story, I want to drop in the people, which are really the focus of the painting and the piece of the painting that's going to give it life. Now there's really not much to show here because the people are so far away. I'm just making suggestions of figures. One of the principles I'm following though is that the further people are away, the less pigment I use, the less paint I use, and that's going to convey this sense of distance. And I'm hoping that when I do that and drop in the soccer ball, you'll get this sort of dynamic movement of people in the distance running forward, people in the foreground running back. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to leave that here to dry, and I'll just come back for a couple finishing touches, but really the structure of this painting is done. Now let's get back to the history. So that was the story of the Endurance until just a few years ago. So Shackleton's captain, Frank Worsley, had taken remarkably accurate coordinates when the ship finally sank. And in 2022, a team of scientists used these coordinates to identify where the wreck might be. So they took the coordinates as a starting point, but then they also used intense computing technology to account for the sea drift and the drift of sea ice from ocean currents over 100 years, which is incredible to me. So they pinpointed the wreck to an area of about 150 miles and about 10,000 feet below sea level. And after 8 days of searching, the Endurance was found in an almost pristine state, preserved by the frigid waters of the sea that had engulfed it a century before. And here's our painting. So let's take a look. And I'm pretty happy with it. I had one idea for an improvement, and I'll share that with you now, and then I will also point out something that I really like about it. So the idea I had was, when I look at this painting, it doesn't exactly translate to the photograph. And I'm not sure why I decided to do a one-to-one replica of the photograph, because what I could have done is cropped this painting here and made this the interesting subject. There's kind of a lot of useless information going on in this painting. There's a lot of dead space down here, and while it looks nice, I feel like if I had zoomed in on this area and cropped it, it would also allow me to give a little more detail to the people. And I think by not doing that, I haven't done justice to the people. They're just abstract figures. When I think about the story of this painting, the people are so important. I wish I had put a little more emphasis on building out the detail of those people to give that feeling and to honor basically what happened there. But I think it's still a lovely painting. I'll point out one thing I really like. I'm pretty stoked about that ship. I am surprised that I was able to get that shifting light on the hull of the ship. I feel like I got the shape pretty good. Actually, when I started painting the ship, I lost my lines from my sketch. I lost them under the first wash, and so I kind of had to freestyle it. So I'm pretty happy with that, and maybe I should paint more ships. In any case, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you painted along, as always, I would love to see what you painted. And if you didn't, I hope you enjoyed the story. It's one of my favorite history stories. Please do like and subscribe if you liked this video and if you care to subscribe. And I will see you next time on Painting the Past. Me